Good afternoon. I'm Karen Painter from the School of Music and the board of the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies. I'd like to welcome you on behalf of the board to a fascinating talk this afternoon by Badema Pitic. And let me just say before I introduce our distinguished speaker today, that the format will be a lecture of about half an hour, and then we're going to have plenty of time for questions and discussion. Feel free to use the hand function if you'd like to pose your question directly, or you can also write it out in chat, and then I'll be reading it. And we have about a half an hour for discussion afterwards. Badema Pitic is Head of Research Services at USC Shoah Foundation, Institute for Visual History and Education. She earned her PhD in ethnomusicology from UCLA. Her work focuses on the intersections of music, memory, and politics in the aftermath of war and genocide in Bosnia-Herzegovina. Her research interests also include oral history and testimony, transitional justice, and perpetrators' music. Recently, Badema has guided the integration of oral history testimonies in the Srebrenica Genocide survivors collected by the Srebrenica Memorial Center into the Shoah Foundation's Visual History Archive. Her work has been published in various journals in ethnology, folklore, and memory studies, as well as more recently in the Routledge Handbook of Religion, Mass Atrocity, and Genocide. She is currently working on an article about the Bosnian Jewish Holocaust survivors' experience of the most recent war in Bosnia. Please join me in welcoming our speaker.
Thank you very much, Karen, for this lovely introduction. And it's a pleasure to be here today and to join the team of the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at the University of Minnesota today. I'm grateful for the invitation and an opportunity to share my work with you. So what I'm going to present today really stems from my doctoral research that I conducted a few years ago now. So it is really a presentation on what we call an ethnographic reality, on what I really encountered in the field those years ago. It's a practice that's still living today. The repertoire that's well and alive and developing, and it's really something that is deeply ingrained into the lives of Srebrenica survivors. So I really wanted to frame this today around survivors themselves, how they present their stories, the mediums, the media they choose to present their stories, and really kind of focus on the stories themselves instead of, theorizing very much about, what they kind of do or what they try to accomplish. What I'm really trying to say is that I want to avoid imposing a lot of interpretation on these stories and really kind of emphasize the survivors' voices because that's really one of the reasons why these stories also are present in music today. So I'm going to begin with the story that I captured during my field work, not in Bosnia, I will say, but here in the United States, in St. Louis, Missouri, which houses around 70,000 Bosnians today. So it's the biggest Bosnian community outside of Bosnia. And during my time in St. Louis, I had the opportunity to meet and sit and talk with many survivors from Bosnia. In this story that I'm going to share with you is a story of one such moment of one family that welcomed me in their new home in St. Louis and share their stories and their songs about Srebrenica with me. So let me share my screen. Okay, so in 2015, I sat in a tiny apartment in St. Louis, Missouri, with 3 generations of a family whose lives had been upended by the Srebrenica Genocide. On their apartment walls, the family taped the remnants of their past life. A black and white wedding photo and a pre-war poster of an izvorna group, Mahovski Slavoji, the family patriarch was a part of before the war. On their shelf, the photo of his young self in a partisan uniform. All of them relics of the life that, like themselves, felt awkwardly misplaced. They all spoke at once, sharing bits and pieces of their lives before, during, and after the genocide. I wrote a song about Srebrenica, you know. The man said to me after we flipped through all of his cherished izvorna group posters, songbooks, and photographs. And he's made sure to spend a lot of time showing me all of those relics. So here's the recording of that song. You get a sense of the sound of this music, which is very specific for this region, very local, I will say, and I believe that all of you noticed with a very specific sound, which also makes it, part of this process of othering of this group by other people from other parts of Bosnia, for whom this music sounds very backward, very strange, very dissonant. And because of that fact, and the fact that it is very localized, this music is very intimate to this community. And that's one of the reasons why, the fact that this music has been taken as a vehicle for spreading the story about the genocide is so fascinating. I'm going to read a little bit from this song because I'm assuming that most of you do not have the language, but the lyrics are very important. So the song says, Srebrenica, you were sold by Gali and Akashi, his little soldier. They're referring to representatives of the UN at the time. You were sold to General Mladic, to Radovan Karadzic, but also Slobodan Milosevic, the president of Serbia at the time. All of that with the help of UN protection forces. Srebrenica brothers needs to fall. That was on July 11, when the Yugo army, the Yugoslav army, attacked. It was on Tuesday at 2 p.m. that Srebrenica had to fall. Aggressors entered the city, slaughtering, to do as they will. They were raised by their mothers to kill, shoot, and slaughter. The people ran away and left their homes only to save their lives. They went to UN protection forces thinking they will protect them. When all of them gathered at one place, they lost all of their hope. UN protection forces and the Yugo army together, they were united troops. There was no comfort for the poor people. Bloody Mladic smiles at them. Anyone who wants can stay here. He executed his bloody plan by dawn. All the men were separated, so the women and children were saved. Mladic touched the heads of young children, carrying them bloody gifts. He gave them gifts for free, but they were left without their fathers. How many women were raped? Only little girls and grandmothers were spared. There was no worse time in life. Poor people were running away through the woods. Many were taken by the Drina River. Poor mothers were left without their sons, some without one, others without 5. This song reaches its end. It has been 16 years at the time when this was written, since Srebrenica fell. It's been looking, waiting, and searching. The world still looks for the culprit. So this is the image of his handwritten lyrics of the song that he showed me during our meeting. The song that we just heard briefly has never been recorded. Its lyrics handwritten on a piece of paper and shared with the intimate family circle. The song and the very context of its performance is a poignant example of how survivors narrate their experience to and for each other, that is within their survivor community, that is bound by the common experience of genocide and well outside of the public and official forms of remembrance and commemoration. This song belongs to a repertoire of survivors' music. Survivors' music, I'm going here after Joshua Pilzer's term, that consists of neotraditional narrative songs called izvorna, or from the source, which is used by a large part of the transnational community of Srebrenica genocide survivors to commemorate the genocide and comment on its aftermath. This repertoire is an offshoot of the broader local musical practice of izvorna music, typical for Eastern and Northeastern Bosnia, that gained its popularity in the 1970s, but is rooted in older local musical forms, particularly the traditional 2-part singing. And you were able to hear a little bit of this in the song that I played. This repertoire is a grassroots local form of witnessing and commentary that predates official and top-down initiatives for capturing survivors' narratives about their experience, namely through court testimonies at the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia and survivor testimony collection projects initiated by several organizations in Bosnia and abroad. While it can be characterized as an quote-unquote alternative mode of testifying when compared to these official and certainly more prominent and public forms of testifying, this repertoire, I would argue, carries with itself a specifically local space of intimacy created through what the ethnomusicologist Kim Burton describes as a shared musical understanding grounded in the shared local tradition. Perhaps more than their stories about the genocide, izvorna songs capture survivor struggles in its aftermath, the struggles that are shared across and understood within this community. First izvorna songs commemorating the recent war emerged during the war itself, in wartime Srebrenica, when local izvorna groups, primarily the izvorna group called Satelliti or Satellites, started performing izvorna songs dedicated to fallen Bosnian Muslim soldiers, but also to boost the morale of the Bosnian army and the local population of the city through the songs glorifying local army commanders, namely the Srebrenica Brigade commander Nasser Oric, which is also a very controversial figure in this history. However, it was not until 2003 that the first izvorna song dedicated specifically to the Srebrenica genocide was created. The creation of this song, called Poletio Soko sa planine, or The Falcon Flew from the Mountain, and performed by the group called Zvuci Podrinja, or The Sounds of Podrinje, coincided with the opening of the Srebrenica Potečari Memorial Center and the beginnings of a more official genocide commemoration. Since that time, dozens of commemorative izvorna songs about the Srebrenica genocide and its victims had been created. These songs can be divided into 2 main types: non-commissioned songs created on musicians' own initiative, who are often genocide survivors themselves. The song that we just heard is one such example, and commissioned songs, or songs ordered and paid for by genocide survivors. Commissioned izvorna songs are concerned with telling a story about a specific individual killed during the genocide and are the most intimate part of this repertoire in that they act as the commissioner's quote-unquote keepsake. They rarely reach wider audiences within the survivor community unless the commemorated individual was well known. Non-commissioned izvorna songs focus on contemporary circumstances in Bosnia more broadly, expressing common opinions about the genocide, such as survivors' critique of genocide denial by the Bosnian Serb government, or self-critique of genocide survivors' negligent attitudes toward genocide remembrance. They also reflect on survivors' perceptions of justice or the lack of justice for Srebrenica victims and survivors. When commenting on this repertoire, most of my interviewees raise the issue of truth in one way or another. In such a comment, the leader of the izvorna group, Zvuci Padrinja, states, "There are many things related to Potocari and Srebrenica that will be remembered. But then the songs are also one part of it. So we know that the genocide happened, that so many people were killed. The songs are one part of the proof, at least I think so. It is one part of the proof that people want this to be known, because the genocide is negated. Some negate that the genocide happened, and people prove it happened through different ways. Each one of these songs is 100% true." End of quote. This statement coincides with similar statements made by other genocide survivors, who often claim that commemorative izvorna songs are, quote, related to the truth about genocide, to the way someone was killed or the way he was while alive, end of quote. And they tell, quote unquote, a true story about, quote unquote, true events that happened in 1995. When it comes to the war, several scholars have pointed out to the existence of differing, quote, ethnic versions of truth, end of quote, in Bosnia, citing, for example, a decentralized education policy in the country that contributed to the, quote, localization of multiple truths. And I'm quoting here after Jelena Subotic, who did a lot of work on this subject, and prevented the creation of a shared and unifying national narrative about the war. Although the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia had been established as a principal truth-seeking mechanism to determine the facts about what happened in Bosnia, what is critical, as scholars note, is the way people on the ground interpret and deal with those facts. The existence of differing official narratives or quote-unquote ethnic truths about Srebrenica determines the way that Srebrenica survivors describe their experiences of the genocide. Survivors are the group that is most affected by these circumstances, in which genocide negation is, as Wagner and Nettelfeld state, used to constitute the present political community in a manner that undercuts the authority of the survivors' voices, end of quote. In this context, commissioned izvorna songs act as survivors' testimonies, their truths about what happened, narrated and presented in the form rooted in their tradition. In addition, they represent acts of witnessing to the suffering of those who perished in the genocide and are employed to memorialize the victims, but also to comment on the continuation of suffering in the genocide's aftermath. Commissioned commemorative izvorna songs are dedicated to specific genocide victims and commissioned by genocide survivors. Izvorna musicians are paid for all commissioned songs they perform, and the process of commissioning a song is pretty standardized. Usually, a commissioner makes contact with an izvorna group, commissions a song, and provides the group with the story details. Musicians then pass on those details to their lyricists, who write the song's lyrics. The lyrics are verified with the commissioner before setting them to music. So what really matters are the lyrics. Music is just the vehicle for the presentation of these lyrics. And if I were to play you, several examples of this music, you would actually notice immediately that the music is very repetitive, even to the outsider to this tradition, most of the songs would actually sound the same. But what really matters in these songs is text. In some cases, customers provide izvorna groups with a finalized text written by someone they know or by them personally. In any case, the process is organized in a way that it ensures the truthfulness, as my interviews say, of the account represented in the song. And it often involves a research conducted by family members to gather the details about their relatives' final accounts. All commissioned songs about the genocide and its victims begin with a spoken dedication containing the name of the deceased person to whom the song is dedicated and the names of the commissioners, as in this example. Something special, so we never forget. A new song dedicated to Mevla Osmanovic from Bunja near Skelani, who disappeared in the fall of Srebrenica. The song is dedicated by his son Adnan and his family. Such dedications are often followed by the well-known and widely used platitude, so we never forget. Some izvorna groups, such as the group Satellite, had even recorded some of their commissioned songs with an accompanying music video recorded at the grave of the deceased. And I would say that this is really a fascinating element of this practice, because we need to take into account that the victims are Muslims. It is completely uncommon in the Islamic tradition to use music for commemorative purposes, and even more so to perform music in this context, so on the grave of the deceased. Sabahuddin Hasanovic from the group Satellite is paid extra for creating these videos, which are usually filmed at the Memorial Center in Potocari, and the group cemetery, the communal cemetery for all the genocide victims, is adjacent to this commemorative, to this memorial center. In other cases, commissioners provide the bands with photos of the deceased from old family albums and photos of the family visiting the memorial center and the deceased grave, which are then used in YouTube videos. These videos also frequently include images of Srebrenica, the memorial center, the Drina River, and other locations associated with the genocide. In this way, commissioned songs include both sound and visuals, becoming sonic memorials to the deceased that complement their physical tombstone. And I have to say, looking back to this practice, and now even sharing this with you, what really strikes me is the similarity between this practice and the way, for example, more traditional oral history testimonies were taken by the organization that I work for, USA Shoah Foundation, during which interviewees not only tell their stories, but they also share photographs from their lives. So these similarities kind of really strike me as something, you know, to explore when it comes to the comparisons between a more traditional format of testimony and these sonic testimonials that these songs represent. One such song is performed by the izvorna group Raspjevane Meraklije, entitled, again, A Story from Srebrenica. This song was commissioned by a young couple from Sweden, Amina and Sanel Avdic, for Amina's late father, who was killed while fleeing Srebrenica through the woods. The main commissioner of this song was Amina's husband, Sanel. He wanted to keep the memory of her father alive through the song because Amina left Srebrenica as a child with her mother and sisters prior to 1995, and she doesn't remember her father well. As the song's lyrics suggest, and my interview with this couple confirms, Sanel asked people who knew Amina's father, the late Taufik Bečirović, about his fate after he fled Srebrenica in July 1995. Taufik was among those killed in the column of men that fled Srebrenica through the woods once the city was captured by the Bosnian Serb forces. The conversation between Taufik and his friend Halil is reconstructed based on some scattered details and the lyricist's imagination, of course. However, the line, "to touch the tiny hands of Amina, my little girl," that found its place in the song is a direct excerpt from a letter Taufik wrote to Amina's mother prior to his death. The music video for this song includes photos of Amina's father with the dates of his birth and death, the memorial center in Potocari, and Amina herself as a grown woman and as a little girl with her family. It also includes footage of her father's burial at Potocari after his exhumation from a mass grave, with Amina and her mother and sisters carrying the coffin and later crying with their hands around his tombstone. And the nuances in this are multiple, I also have to say, because just like it is not at all typical to use music to commemorate the dead in Islam, it is also not typical for women to participate in that rituals. It is usually the men who attend the burial. It is the men who carry the coffin. But in this case, because of the majority of men being wiped out and only the women and the children being left behind, the women needed to take on this responsibility. So this song also in a way capture this consequence of the genocide, which is also, you know, some sort of this continuum of suffering that these people are experiencing. So in this way, the song and the accompanying video really do paint a continuum of suffering that extends far beyond the very event of genocide. Oh, did I just, I'm sorry about that. Let me reshare. I'm gesticulating a lot, which I need to stop doing. All right, let's see. Oh, something is happening. Okay. All right, it won't let me do it. I'm sorry. It will need to stay like this. But I'm going to play you a little bit of this song, so you get a sense of the song and also, more importantly, the accompanying video.
Opet prišaje iz Srebrenice.
I will go a little bit forward. All right.
Prijatelju, da je volimo jednu želju. Prije nego što bitku izgubim, da mi jako zagrlim i ljubim. Da dodirnem male devojčice, u Amine moje djevojčice. Ali, halčo, dobri prijatelju, ja tu neću dočekati želju. Mene snaga izdaje polako, valjda vrate suđeno je tako. Znam da će im vrlo teško pasti, što će morat bez svog babe rasti.
There you go. So briefly, you were able to see Amina and her sisters and mothers carrying the coffin with the remains of their father and husband. You saw his pre-war photograph of the deceased, and also some most recent photographs of Amina from her wedding. So this is just an excerpt. This is a long song. This is just an excerpt from of the lyrics from this song, and I will read some part of it briefly. All right, so okay, I will start here. There is hope for survival. He both worries and glows from happiness. he talks about the lyricist talks about the deceased, because he goes toward Tuzla. This is the city that belonged to the Bosnian army. So it was held by the Bosnian army and considered a free territory during the war. Where his thoughts are every day, where his 3 daughters and dear Zinata, his wife, are. He's thinking going through narrow roads and finds his friend Haucho on the cursed Kamenica plain, where this great warrior will fall. The soil is plowed by cursed grenades. It is terrible to watch that brother. Many people lay in blood. The first beside me was Stefo. This is the deceased, Taufik. While he had a voice and strength, he mentioned his dear ones. Zinata is with my 3 daughters around Tuzla. Check that somewhere. Tell them, Haucho, a friend of mine, that their father had one wish before I lose my fight, to hug them hard and kiss them, to touch the tiny hands, give me a second, of Amina, my little girl. But Haucho, my dear friend, I won't make it to do that. My strength leaves me slowly. I guess it is meant to be, brother. I know it will be hard for them to grow up without their father. Good luck on your further travel. So of course, this is the lyricist's imagination, you know, that's playing part in here with the interpretation of the last moments that Taufik had. But that excerpt from Taufik's letter to Amina's mother, where he says, to touch the tiny hands of Amina, my little girl, is the authentic, you know, artifact that got included into this commemorative song. So non-commissioned commemorative izvorna songs address this continuum of suffering more broadly, serving as a social commentary on survivors' struggles in the aftermath of genocide. The grief of those who have survived is a recurring theme in the majority of non-commissioned songs, which instead of dealing with those who had been killed, deal with those who have survived, primarily women and children. In their 2013 song, Far Away Are Our Potocari, the izvorna group Satelliti narrates. Here again, the trucks are driving. They are driving softly towards Srebrenica, all the way from Tuzla over Sarajevo. A sad mother weeps her tears. They are carrying the bones of our shahids. These are religious martyrs. Dear mother, my heart is tearing apart. White roses are thrown on the road. They are thrown by the crying mothers. Mothers cry and chant El-Fatiha. This is an Islamic prayer. Someone's sisters and someone's grandchild. The tears are pouring, faces are crying. Far away is our Srebrenica. Far away are our Potocari, our buried brothers and friends. Mother has buried 3 sons, and now she cries over the 4th one. Mother has fallen in front of a truck. She let her troubled soul out. That is how mother's heart suffers. She couldn't stand this anymore. I will not play you the song, but this is what this song refers to. It depicts the annual transportation of the remains of identified victims from mass graves to their final resting place next to the memorial center in Potocari. It documents the aftermath of the genocide and the ongoing agony experienced by those who have been waiting for years to find and bury their loved ones. Every year before the annual mass burial in Potocari on July 11th, people gather to pay their respects to the victims on the streets of the cities through which the trucks carrying the victims' remains pass. And this is an image of that. This is the truck that carries the victims' exhumed remains through the streets of Sarajevo on its way to Srebrenica. Among those who gather are internally displaced survivors from the Srebrenica area, who now live in other Bosnian cities and for whom Srebrenica remains far away. Among those displaced is Sulja Bukvic, with whose song I opened today's talk and with whom I'd like to conclude. Sulja and his family remain in St. Louis, far away from Srebrenica and from Potocari. By the time he finished his songs about the genocide on that day in 2015, all those present were crying. For one woman, the song triggered her worst memories of the fall of Srebrenica and the atrocities she had witnessed during those few days in July of 1995. In that moment, the song paved the way for her testimony. Concluding her disturbing story and still crying, she said, "There are many things." I'm sorry, this is the wrong quote, so I'm going to return to this. I'm just going to read it. "This is a personal story, the story from my life that I won't forget while I'm alive. Because we had everything before the war, then I survived the war while in the best years of my life. And then we were left with nothing, and I went into the world with no one of my own. These songs are very good, and they should not be forgotten. They are instructive to all of us. They are the truth." Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pitic. That's fascinating and very moving. It raises so many important issues, both in musicology, memory studies, genocide studies. I'd like to call on any of you who have questions right now. Otherwise, I can start with some of my own comments and questions. I'm just looking at the listing. Well, let me just jump in and then we'll see who can use the hand function. I don't see anything in the chat yet. I was wondering if you could contrast this with the Stolperstein practice, which is so public, both in the choice of location and its dissemination on the web, honoring Holocaust victims, and discuss whether there is an attempt to sort of formalize or publicize the songs, or do you think that this will remain a more flexible tradition? And how will this change, say, in 10 years or 20 years? Do you have any sort of comments about that and where you see this tradition heading?
Yeah, so what I didn't mention today, and I kind of assumed that we would have an opportunity to discuss, is this is not really a unique practice. And as you say, you know, even during and after the Holocaust, it was not unusual for Holocaust survivors to, you know, repurpose the existing songs, put lyrics related to the events of the Holocaust to those existing melodies in order to preserve these stories. And we can find many such examples in other traditions. For example, the ethnomusicologist Jonathan Ritter did a lot of work on such a local tradition in Peru that is focused on the commemoration of the civil war there that took place in the 1980s. So in that sense, you know, this repertoire really belongs to that broader phenomenon of testimonial music. It is unique to Bosnia, to Bosnian context, in a sense that this is really a precedent in a way, you know, to the tradition. This is really an example where you know, the tradition that this musical practice belongs to, and religion, Islam, that the survivors belong to, are kind of in conflict, which makes it really fascinating. At this point, there are no attempts to publicize or officialize this practice. And I think I would say that the reason for not doing so really lies in the fact that many perceive this to be not the most appropriate way to commemorate the genocide. And that is not only the sentiment, you know, shared by, let's say, broader public that doesn't belong to this community or doesn't understand this musical practice, but it is also shared within the survivor community itself. Not all survivors listen to these songs. Not all survivors commission these songs. This is just one segment of this population that kind of, turned to this musical practice in the aftermath of genocide to express their stories about the genocide and their feelings about its aftermath. When it comes to where this practice is heading, I'm not sure that I can kind of, predict that. At the time when I was doing my field work, there was really a huge number of these songs produced, but that was also a significant moment in the history of commemoration of this genocide, because it was the 20th anniversary of the genocide. The genocide was very, very present in the public discourse, etc. So that production of these songs was could be seen as a response, local response to those events. I always keep track and am in touch with these izvorna groups that I collaborated with back in the day. While the songs about Srebrenica are still occasionally released, I have to say that nowadays it's not that frequent like it used to be, for example, around the 20th anniversary of the genocide. And I believe that one of the answers to that also lies in the fact that for these izvorna musicians who perform these songs and write these songs, it is not, the most lucrative business at this moment. And when I attended, even back in the day, some of these performances, the musicians were even then very careful in balancing the amount of performance of these songs versus performance of non-commemorative izvorna songs, which are very cheerful, in their nature, because that is really, what kind of speaks to the wider audiences. But I do believe that this remains kind of as a testament, to the moment in this genocide commemoration that is very significant and really tells about the multiplicity of ways through which survivors kind of make sense of their past and share that past with each other.
Thanks. I'm going to keep an eye open for hands raised, but I'm curious about this idea of the contested status of these songs, and that some view that is not kind of an authentic or not an ideal way to commemorate. But I'm going to follow up after Alejandro. Could you pose your question?
Thank you, Karen, and thank you, Badema, for a fascinating talk. I actually wanted to follow up somewhat on Karen's question and your answer. And I was wondering if I was interested in the fact that this somewhat pushes the boundaries of the religious tradition with the music. And correct me if I'm wrong, but it's also the mourning of the death when they have, like, the bodies, when they're not complete, or the remains, that is also in Srebrenica is also something that there was somehow somewhat contested, right? So are we like seeing how the religious framework is being becoming more flexible in that respect? Mm-hmm. And the other, related question is that usually religion and, prayers and liturgy offers the sort of cultural resources, right? Or the cultural toolbox for mourning, right? And for commemorating the dead. And so there my question is there any sort of blending between the Islamic religious tradition on the Islamic liturgy and the songs, or are they completely like on parallel paths?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Those are good questions. So yeah, it is very contested, and I would also say very complex when it comes to the role of religion in the commemoration of the Srebrenica genocide. And one of the reasons is that that kind of, roots back even to the wartime, when the Islamic community in Bosnia became very politicized, so to speak, and involved in the political matters during the wartime. So at that moment, during the war, and it was, I think, already early in 1993, the Islamic community proclaimed all of the fallen Bosnian Muslim soldiers in the war as shahidi, which are religious martyrs. And that designation was also transferred to the Srebrenica victims who were killed during the genocide. And because of that designation, the very commemoration of the genocide, the official one, that takes place every July in Srebrenica, has very strong religious connotations. And that is especially highlighted through the fact that the burial is a religious one. And because it's a religious burial, and because of the constraints of the Islamic tradition, etc., it is making it very, closed, so to speak, very, very limited in its capacity to integrate other, non-religious aspects of commemoration. And because of that, I would say that these are in parallel. There is really no melding. But I also have to say that because of that, there are other segments of musical commemoration that do not necessarily belong to this tradition, to the izvorna tradition, but that are present in the commemoration, such as, for example, religious commemorative music, which in that context is considered more appropriate, right? Something that's kind of allowable, or even what I refer to as the official music of genocide, which is a classical piece of music, an oratorio that was written to commemorate the genocide and is now performed at the commemoration every year in Potocari. But this local musical tradition can hardly, as it is, find its way in these public representations of genocide.
Sandra and Nika, could I ask you to pose your questions right together, one after another, and then Vadima can answer both together, and we can have follow-up if we need to? Sandra, do you want to go first?
Sure. Thank you so much for your presentation. This was a very new concept to me, and I do research aspects of the genocide itself. My question was, both examples that you mentioned in your presentation were commissioned from the diaspora. And I was wondering if this was something that was more commonly done or commissioned from the outside as opposed to from within the country. It probably has something to do also with, how much it costs and the value probably. But I was just curious if it's the practice of those who live outside to sort of like contribute more to the commemoration of whom they lost versus the local practice.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Thank you.
And Nika, can you pose yours and then we'll answer both?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much for your fascinating talk. It was so great. I had two sort of interrelated questions. One, you already mentioned what you call the official music that's played, the Srebrenica oratorio.
Yeah.
I was going to ask how you would compare that music and text to this more localized tradition. And the other question was about gender and how thought it was fascinating how the women have started carrying the coffins and are kind of upending some of those gendered norms. And you also write about the gendered norms of the oratorio and wondering about if you could say more about how gender is present in the izvorna songs as well.
Of course, yeah, all good questions. I hope I'm gonna do them justice and that I'm going to remember. So for the first question that Sandra posed about diaspora, that's a really good one. And I did indeed do work on both in Bosnia and in diaspora in the United States. And you are right, both of the examples that I used were commissioned by members of diaspora, and it is more frequent for them to commission their songs. When I did my research, you know, something that emerged in relation to this is different kinds of memory works that happen in diaspora and in Bosnia, which is kind of conditioned by the overall context. You know, people in diaspora kind of care more about or are more affected, so to speak, by, you know, being apart from their homeland, overwhelmed with nostalgia. So even those songs, izvorna songs that circulate within this diasporic part of the survivor community, they express kind of their, I call them songs of longing in my research, because it is not for them that much about, you know, countering genocide denial, about returning to their pre-war homes. Those are the immediate concerns of those who remained in Bosnia, who are, you know, experiencing those issues on a daily basis. For people in diaspora, their immediate concerns are, you know, this longing for their homeland and kind of, you know, the merging of these two worlds that they now inhabit. And it's also, you're right, it has a financial aspect to it, because those survivors who live in Bosnia are in a much better position to afford commissioning these songs than are those who remain in Bosnia. But that's not to say that there are no commissioned songs that were commissioned by those who live in Bosnia. It's just that it happened that I used these two examples in my presentation today. When it comes to the official music of the genocide, the Srebrenica oratorio, or the Srebrenica's Inferno, how do they compare? So this Inferno is also a commissioned piece of music. It was commissioned by local officials in Sarajevo at the occasion of the opening of the Srebrenica Memorial Center in 2003. So it's kind of significant that this year triggered all of these instances of musical commemoration, both on the official, but also on this more grassroots level among the survivor community. although the oratorio kind of, because of its position in the genocide commemoration, it kind of really is well known in the public. It even became indexical, so to speak, of the Srebrenica genocide, because it's performed every year at the commemoration. But what is interesting about the oratorio, although publicly it has such a status, if you go around Srebrenica survivors, you know, this is not necessarily always the perception that they have about this piece of music. For them, this piece of music is not part of their tradition. That is something that has been imposed upon them. Many of them don't even understand, you know, what this music is. Some of them refer to it as ilahia, as a religious piece of music. They don't even understand that it's a classical piece of music. But there are also differences within the survivor community. If you ask survivors who are more publicly present, who are you know, more activist in their efforts for the recognition of genocide, they know very well, you know, the significance of this music, and they associate it with the commemoration. But if you approach survivors who kind of keep to themselves, who are not part of these efforts, the oratorio is on the brinks of their genocide commemoration, just like the izvorna music is on the brinks of the official genocide commemoration. So they are like these two. And when it comes to gender, so I was worried that this is going to happen, that I'm going to forget what exactly what
Gender in 2 minutes.
exactly your question was. But I will just say that what's interesting about gender when it comes to izvorna music is that although now, with many men being killed during the genocide, women were forced to take on the responsibility and the roles that they did not necessarily have in this very patriarchal, very traditional society. What's interesting that is not reflected in the izvorna tradition. So if you look at the izvorna music scene, those who perform this music, those who commission this music, they are men. Women do not really participate that much in this tradition. And that, of course, has, you know, roots in the tradition itself, the way, you know, it was kind of structured within this wider, let's say, local community, you know, where it was associated with late night parties, alcohol, etc. And in a patriarchal society, women would not participate in such occasions. So that carried through, interestingly. I'm sorry, we're out of time.
No, actually, Alejandro gave us permission to extend the discussion. So Amila, can I call on you to?
Yes, thank you so much. I was worried I didn't get a chance to ask the question, so I appreciate the time extension. And Badema, thank you so much for your presentation and your talk. I missed the first half. I was teaching, so I was rushing to catch this. I very much appreciate your work. I've read some of it online, and though I missed this part of the presentation, forgive me if my question is a little bit off, but I was curious if you have done any work on rap music, because it's such a big part of Bosnian culture post-war, right? And in particular, the kind of rap culture that you see with the multidirectional memory structures with Germany and Israel, funny enough. So there's this interesting connection between these three countries, through rap music. So I was wondering, and I know, like I said, it might be a little bit off topic from this particular presentation, but I was just curious if you had any reactions to that or insights. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for raising that. I have to say that when I was doing my research, that was definitely something that emerged. And at some point, I even considered pursuing it. But unfortunately, there was just so much, to cover with this that I unfortunately didn't really do any significant research on the topic. But that is, so what I encountered, and the reason I was considering that is that I encountered actually some amateur rap musicians in diaspora who wrote commemorative rap songs about the genocide. So these are descendants of genocide survivors who now chose this medium to commemorate the genocide. But there's so much going on with that, right? If we consider the history of rap, etc. And now, these people appropriating it for that purpose, that is really fascinating. And I wish I could have done more. Maybe that's something, to pursue in the future. But I already have had a lot on my plate with this izvorna repertoire and classical music. I also did research on religious music, and I was kind of trying to, keep it, within some reasonable boundaries at the time. But thank you for reminding me of that. That's something to return to.
Yeah, I only ask because there's some fascinating work that connects, because of the displacement to Germany and Western European countries, that connects the narrative of the Holocaust specifically to the Bosnian genocide,
right,
and talks about it through rap so often. And then a lot of these rappers or musicians end up somehow connecting themselves to Israel, and sometimes even moving to Israel and finding this to be their new home as an extension of like what Yugoslavia was at some point. So there's a lot of interesting multi-directional memory frameworks happening between sort of the three countries.
That's really fascinating. I would like to talk to you more about that if you are up.
Yeah, I would be happy. Thank you so much for answering my question.
Just one quick final question, Irma, and please.
All right, thank you, and I'll be quick. So because I am part of the diaspora in the United States, so I wonder if there's, I don't know if this will be a two-part question. First of all, if I came in a little late, so if I missed this part, do they have izvorna songs about, are they commissioned by people ever that are not from Srebrenica or related to that area? Because the sense is that there's sometimes this perception of like almost like a hierarchy of suffering, because there's a label of genocide to Srebrenica. The rest of us go, if you meet someone from there, oh, they had it worse.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's that feeling. And so I guess the relationship is like, if there are other songs commissioned by people from other areas about people from other areas, and how you view that sort of that understanding of that label of genocide, right, for that region, and it not being placed on other parts, debatably so, obviously. Yeah, so
that's your question, right? You said there were two parts.
Yeah, well, I don't even know if they came out to be two parts, but
okay, no, that's fine. That's fine. Yeah, okay, great. Nadema, great.
I she understood me because she was nodding.
No, thank you for raising that. That hierarchy is definitely something I encountered. And encountered in my conversations with survivors, etc., and also, just conducting participant observations and overhearing some of the conversations that were happening in the background. There is definitely this sentiment among wider survivor communities about, the Srebrenica genocide receiving this attention and, kind of being the central story of the Bosnian War, and at the same time, the survivors of other instances of mass violence being kind of, put in the background and not receiving this much attention as they are supposed to receive. I think that's really a reflection of the wider problem. I think that's not really, the survivors' problem to address. This is really kind of a reflection of wider, how to say, political context, but also context in which this single event was recognized as an act of genocide, and therefore, receiving this much attention. That's something that, I kind of addressed in my work, and something that I'm also struggling with personally, because, I survived the war in Bosnia. Struggling with because it is impossible to observe Srebrenica as an isolated event. Srebrenica is really a culmination of this continuous cluster of violence that took place in Bosnia over 4 years of war. It's not that the Srebrenican people had it worse. It's just that it's their suffering that was recognized, as an act of genocide. If you know about the history of the war, you would know, that entire villages were wiped out, and people, suffered equally in many parts of Bosnia. When it comes to that in this repertoire, maybe that's something for me to take and reflect on, because when I talk about survivors of Srebrenica, I refer them, as the Srebrenica genocide survivors. But as we know, those who survived the genocide in Srebrenica were not necessarily from Srebrenica. Actually, most of them were not. They were forced to leave their home, the surrounding villages and towns near Srebrenica already in 1992, and go to Srebrenica as refugees, and unfortunately found themselves there when the city fell in 1995. So yes, there are commissioned songs that are not about Srebrenica necessarily. When I talk about the Srebrenica genocide, I'm really talking about this wider community, this kind of wider context of suffering in Eastern Bosnia. And that's reflected through the songs about other parts in that area that find their place in the songs. And, as I mentioned, even during this talk today, I'm not sure if you were here during that part, but even some of the dedications really are kind of a reflection of that, like this is a song for this person who is from this village next to this place, but that's not Srebrenica. So it's kind of positioning and, kind of stating a certain kind of identity already, there with that dedication. So this is a lot of rambling, but I hope you kind of got a little bit from my answer.
Badema, thank you so much. I've taken so many notes, and this is so inspiring for me in my teaching on genocide and for many here in the meeting in their scholarship. And I encourage you to ask follow-up questions via email to Badema Pitic. And thank you again for a fascinating and very moving talk.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
All right.
Have a good day.
Have a good afternoon. Goodbye, everyone. Thank you for coming.